From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President-elect Donald Trump heads to Capitol Hill to meet with Senate Republicans as lawmakers look for answers on the path forward for his legislative agenda. We'll have more ahead with Republican Congressman Bryan Steil of Wisconsin.
Plus, Trump turns to the Supreme Court to try to stop his hush money sentencing on Friday as the DOJ seeks to release part of special counsel Jack Smith's report on Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Attorney Deanna Paul will weigh in this hour.
And Bloomberg's David Gura with us in Washington today sits down for a wide-ranging exit interview with SEC Chair Gary Gensler. We'll bring you part of their conversation. Thanks for being with us on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kaylee, we've got our eyes on Capitol Hill today. Donald Trump expected to arrive. There are questions about whether he might visit the rotunda as well, where the remains of Jimmy Carter lie, at least for another 24 hours here. His funeral is set for tomorrow.
Indeed. State funeral is tomorrow. Of course, all of the living presidents, former presidents and current, are expected to attend, Donald Trump included, but President Joe Biden as well, who is, as we speak, traveling back from California, where we heard him speak earlier at a fire station in Santa Monica about the fires that are ravaging the L.A. region.
We're prepared to do anything and everything as long as it takes to contain these fires and help reconstruct and make sure we get it back to normal. It's going to be a hell of a long way. It's going to take time, but we're in it. The federal government is here to stay as long as you need us, everything you need.
Let's get an update now up first on the devastating fires in the Los Angeles area from Bloomberg's climate and energy reporter David Baker. He joins us from our San Francisco bureau. And David, this is remarkable, seeing these images of flames essentially in downtown L.A., Malibu, the Palisades, the Getty Villa. These are areas that a lot of people across the country recognize. What's the latest on the size, scope of these fires, and what's next?
Well, in terms of the scope, they keep growing. They have not stopped their forward progress, and we probably won't see anything like that for a couple of days. Collectively, they're above 23,000 acres right now. And while California has had much bigger fires than that in the past, we haven't had bigger fires than that in our major cities. Typically, we've had this problem in rural areas, smaller cities, suburban areas. But the big problem here is this is striking right near the heart of L.A. We have in particular a fire that's burning in the Pacific Palisades close to the coast that is marching towards Malibu, which already had to evacuate about a month ago for another fire. And we have another fire to the northeast of downtown that is bearing down on Pasadena. And that also has the potential for a lot of damage. Between all of these fires, we have more than 125,000 people evacuated, and they're trying to find other places to stay, hotels where they can move their families, friends, family members that they might be able to move in with. We've heard of people like fleeing to vacation homes or just going to visit their parents halfway up the coast because that's what they can do. So everybody is scrambling right now to get to safety, and it has really upended life in the city.
Well, of course, our thoughts are with everyone who has been affected and could be in harm's way at this point. And we'll look forward to your continued reporting on this. Bloomberg's David Baker, thank you so much. President-elect Trump is expected to meet with Senate Republicans in Washington this evening, meantime, with lawmakers looking for clarity on how he'd like to move his legislative agenda forward. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Dan Flatley. So, Dan, he's going to meet with Senate Republicans specifically who are in favor of a two-track scenario, if you will, compared to the House one big bill. Are we going to get an answer finally?
Well, we don't know. I think we may get an answer. Whether that's the final answer, I think, only time will tell. Trump was asked about this yesterday. He's talked about it, on Truth Social. And what we know at this point, basically, is that they can't come up with an exact strategy for how to do this. There's discussion of doing two separate bills. There's discussion of doing one beautiful, big, beautiful bill. All of that is kind of on the table. But what is really important here from Trump's perspective is that he has a very ambitious economic agenda that he wants to get through. He can do some of it on his own through his executive powers, like tariffs on some goods. That's a big part of his agenda. But tax cuts, he needs Congress for that. And in order to do that, you have to sort of do things in sequence, right? So one of the thoughts is to do tax cuts first, to move that up to the start of the agenda, and then, see what Trump does on tariffs, what revenue you can get there. How are you going to pay for all of this stuff? You need to raise the debt ceiling as well. There's a lot of different things in the mix here. But that's what we expect Senate Republicans to discuss with President-elect Donald Trump this evening, as well as what he wants to do on the border. And how are they going to do that? Because that's a huge priority for the president-elect as well, and also for many Senate Republicans. So we're expecting that Trump will, rally with his troops, so to speak, but that he will also have to soothe some concerns about how all this is going to be paid for, how it's going to move, and what kind of support he'll be able to rally for all of that. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens or what comes out of this meeting today.
That part we do know. That meeting's set to begin a little bit less than an hour from now, assuming that it's on time. Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, thank you so much. President-elect Trump has also asked the Supreme Court today to get involved in his hush money case and prevent the sentencing that is scheduled for 2 days from now. The 41-page filing is Donald Trump's effort to derail the case before his inauguration, of course, on the 20th. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief, Julie Fine. It's good to have you, Julie. What's going to happen on Friday?
Well, essentially what they're asking, this is a final effort, like you said, Joe, to get rid of this before the inauguration. It's an effort, however, to get the Supreme Court involved with a state case. So the judge has already said that President Trump will not face any jail time for this. So the question is now if the Supreme Court decides, all right, let's throw this out before we get there. No matter what happens on Friday, we're talking about the court and the court of public opinion. And in this case here, President Trump simply wants this to go away. And the Department of Justice does not want a different case to go away. That is the probe into President Trump overturning or his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Now, of course, the Justice Department wants to say that this is an issue. They would like the release of those documents. However, a judge in Florida has decided to have a temporary order. That temporary order, of course, bars the release of that report. However, the Justice Department, in their last-ditch effort, is saying all they want to do is release the part of the report that has to do with overturning the 2020 elections. It does not have to do with the missing documents case. That's the part that they want to get out in public. So again, time running out on that one as the Justice Department is about to change. So a lot of legality still going on for President Trump as he gets ready to take office.
All right, Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief, Julie Fine, thank you so much. Coming up, we'll go live to Capitol Hill ahead of Donald Trump's visit there this evening. Republican Congressman Bryan Steil of Wisconsin is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think you're going to get the big ticket items done. It's going to be the secondary issues that are going to be much, much harder. And we need to lower, I think Republicans need to lower their expectations on being able to achieve that in a timely manner.
That was former Congressman Patrick McHenry on the early edition of Balance of Power today on the reality he sees for Republicans in the 119th Congress. Joining us now on Bloomberg TV and radio for more is one of them, Republican Congressman Bryan Steil of Wisconsin, chair of the House Administration Committee and member of the Financial Services Committee, is live with us from Capitol Hill, where we have just seen President-elect Donald Trump's motorcade arrive ahead of what is expected to be a paying of respects to former President Jimmy Carter, and then, Congressman, a meeting with some of your colleagues in the upper chamber, Senate Republicans, on the path forward for budget reconciliation. And I wonder, from your purview in the House, knowing what we've heard from your Speaker, Mike Johnson, about the preference for one big bill, if you actually expect that could be the outcome advocated for by the president-elect after tonight, something definitive.
Do one bill, because I think it's easier to do one big negotiation than it is two tough negotiations. That said, at the end of the day, what are we actually concerned about? Getting the policies across the line to get this country back on track. And so whatever vehicle is needed to actually get these policies through and across the line is the actual play call that we need to make. I think one tough negotiation beats two tough negotiations, but we have so much work to get done, in particular at a period of time where taxes will rise if Congress doesn't act, and a need to secure the border. Those are the top two issues that are in front of us. We're going to have to get a lot of work done to move those across the line.
The conventional wisdom is, Congressman, it takes a lot longer to write the tax legislation, and you could buy yourself a couple of months to do that while addressing the border now. That people who elected Donald Trump want to see that happen first and as soon as possible. Is this going to delay the process to deal with the border as you wait to handle taxes if it's one big, beautiful bill?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the president can act in executive action, taking significant moves forward as it relates to the border on day one. Again, he can reinstate stay in Mexico, restart border wall construction, end catch and release, end abuse of the parole system, all through executive action. In many ways, this is simply unwinding what President Biden has done in return to the President Trump era policies that were securing the border just 4 years ago. And so a lot of action is going to take place in securing the border right out of the gates. Further legislation is needed to make sure that we have the funding in place, that we have the men and women of Border Patrol not only funded, but also hired and engaged. And so there's a lot of work to be done that does require congressional action. I'd love to get that done as soon as we can. I understand the argument to move quickly on that, giving us time to negotiate the tax bill. But again, at the end of the day, what really matters is we get both border security and taxes done. I'm of the view that one bill, one tough negotiation beats two. But either way, I'm more focused in on getting the policies done than I am getting tangled up in the process negotiations that this town loves to talk about.
Well, and of course, this town is dominated by two political parties, so I do wonder about the role of Democrats in all this, sir. We spoke with Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts on this program last night, and this is what he had to say about the way in which the Speaker might need to work across the aisle. Take a listen.
I think Mike Johnson is going to find that it is a lot easier to count to 218 when you have a pool of 435 votes rather than a pool of 220 votes, especially because the bill that they want to do on a reconciliation pathway is going to explode the deficit.
I think his suggestion there, Congressman, was this notion that there are a lot of conservative, fiscal conservative Republicans in the House who may not take kindly to some of the things that could be in this bill. Are Democratic votes going to be required?
Well, the whole reason we're having this discussion is the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. Republicans have majority control in the Senate, but under Senate parliamentary procedure, as we know, you need to get 60 votes, which requires Democrats in the Senate to come on board. Reconciliation allows us to move forward with 50 Republican votes in the Senate. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to get a lot done with, unfortunately, with Democrats not joining us to move forward on that legislation. Other pieces won't pass the Byrd test in the Senate. It's going to require, most likely, Senate votes in the Senate, or Democratic votes in the Senate. That said, I think there's a lot of stuff that both parties can look at and come together on. We saw earlier this week the Reagan-Riley bill that would actually deport illegal immigrants that have committed crimes. We saw a number of Democrats coming on board with that bill, a bill that I think could actually now pass the United States Senate. A handful of Democratic senators have said they support it. If we're putting forward in the House common sense conservative reforms, I think the American people know that those are the right moves. We're going to see Democrats come along. In other areas, maybe less partisan in nature, digital assets. I think we have an opportunity to bring Democrats on board with conservative policies, making sure that the United States of America is leading in the digital asset space and not simply giving our authority away to other countries who are moving forward in the legislation in that space.
Well, Congressman, assuming this is going to be the path for taxes reconciliation without Democrats' involvement in the House, let's just talk about your family conversation within the Republican conference, because it's not just extending the 2017 package, it's other items, including SALT. We spoke earlier with New York Congressman Mike Lawler today on Bloomberg, who's introduced, in fact, reintroduced a bill to raise the SALT cap to $100,000 for single filers, $200,000 for married couples filing jointly. You know this is a big deal for our audience here on Bloomberg. Here's what Lawler said about the issue today. Congressman, let's listen.
The $10,000 cap is woefully insufficient. It's had a negative impact on states like New York, New Jersey, and California, three of the high tax states where this has most acutely impacted. Certainly, we have a coalition, and given our small majority in the House, it's certainly a powerful coalition.
Congressman, what happens, though, when you leave New York, New Jersey, Connecticut? What do voters in your district think about this idea of raising the SALT cap of any magnitude, especially this? Why should the people of Janesville cover the property taxes for people in Greenwich, Connecticut?
I think that's the right question to be asking. Why should hardworking Americans be subsidizing jurisdictions that choose to apply high taxes to themselves? It was correctly noted there by my colleague Mike Lawler that New York, New Jersey, and other states in the Northeast Corridor in particular have incredibly high state and local property taxes. They do that because they place those taxes upon themselves. Allowing hardworking Americans or forcing hardworking Americans to subsidize those high taxes of individuals in high tax jurisdictions simply removes the impetus for them to address the high taxes that they have in the first place. If an individual in New York or Connecticut or New Jersey wants to have a high level of service and wants to vote in liberal Democrats to raise their property taxes, so be it. I don't think that hardworking Americans should be subsidizing that. At the end of the day, what we need to be focused in on is the tax code is pro-growth policies. And in particular, two policies stand out that we need to make sure we have our eyes on, and that's the R&D tax credit the R&D tax credit and other pro-growth policies to make sure that we're investing in the United States of America, we're bringing jobs here, we're growing the economy, and in so doing, revenue will increase.
Congressman, it's great to have you and appreciate your being with us here as a member of the new Congress. That's Republican Congressman Bryan Steil of Wisconsin. Janesville, Wisconsin, Kaylee, 65,000, almost the same population as Greenland.
Yeah. Greenland in the news this week.
Absolutely.
Donald Trump finding that a pretty attractive asset for national security purposes.
They don't have salt there either.
I guess not.
Coming up, Bloomberg's David Gura's conversation with SEC Chair Gary Gensler. An important conversation up next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Today, outgoing SEC Chair Gary Gensler sat down for an exit interview with Bloomberg's David Gura, who asked him about the criticism he's faced and whether the environment has changed for regulators.
I think it does change. What we do here at this great agency is look out for everyday Americans, people just trying to save for a better future and try to move through things that help them, like we've done, like even shortening the settlement cycle from 2 days to 1 day. Might sound geeky behind the scenes, but it means you get your money 1 day faster, for instance, or getting privacy notices. There was no federal rule that you needed to get a notice if your data was hacked, and we put in place some rules to do that. So we're looking out for everyday Americans, trying to lower the cost of the markets to trade stocks, to trade the bonds.
Let me ask you about one facet of that $120 million trillion.
Trillion. It's a big number.
It's a T with a T, and that's crypto. And you often will point out it's a small sliver of that total multi-trillion-dollar package. But you came into this job, you gave a big speech in which you analogized the crypto world to the Wild West. I guess that makes you the sheriff. So as you get ready to hang up your spurs, is it less of a Wild West? I'm really belaboring the metaphor, but is it less of a Wild West than it was as you leave this office?
Look, I came in, my predecessor, Jay Clayton, who was in this office, had also tried to address this new emerging part of finance. And as you say, it's less than 1% of our overall financial markets. But it was then when Jay was trying to address it, and he brought 80 enforcement actions in this area. We've brought in about 100 in our 4 years. It was consistent. It's maybe about 5% of what we do in our law enforcement. That means there's 95%, in a sense, unfortunately, about other things, scammers and fraudsters and so forth. But in this field, it's rife with bad actors. And let me just split the field into two just for a minute. The public knows a lot about Bitcoin, which is, depending upon its market value on any given day, is 2/3 to 80% of the market value of crypto. And then there's everything else, or some people say Bitcoin and Ethereum and everything else. These 10 or 15,000 projects, they're raising money from the public, and the public's investing, or the public's investing hoping for a better future. I've been around finance for over 4 decades, and everything in the markets trade on a mixture of fundamentals and sentiment at any given time. But I've never seen a field that's so much wrapped up in sentiment and not so much about fundamentals. And these 10,000 to 15,000 projects, many of them will not survive. They're like venture capital investments. They're not going to survive. But there are also a fair number of small pump and dump schemes and other things in this. And of course, we've lived through a few years where, they became notorious, but they're in jail. The Sam Bankman-Frieds and the CZs and the Do Kwons, where tens of billions of dollars were lost by investors.
Gary Gensler in conversation with Bloomberg's David Gura. Really something, Kaylee, you covered Gary Gensler in the SEC for some time. You used to help to anchor our crypto coverage. Fascinating to hear him talk about building on what Chair Clayton did in the prior administration.
Yeah, trying not to cast all of the blame entirely on himself, as he obviously has drawn a lot of ire from the crypto industry, which is facing a different reality now that Paul Atkins presumably will be confirmed to be the next SEC chair. And a lot of things that Gary Gensler pursued could meet their end under an Atkins SEC, including climate disclosure, some of the rules he had proposed for hedge funds and others.
Seems happy, though. Seems relaxed.
Yeah.
He's packing up the office.
Spurs.
So you can see our full conversation, of course, by the way, on the internet, on the terminal, and check out David Gura's Big Take podcast. We'll have a lot more of their conversation, in fact. We've got our eyes on Capitol Hill, Kaylee, where Donald Trump's motorcade has arrived. For the meeting that we've been describing, there's a live view of the carriage entrance at the U.S. Capitol. Donald Trump and his advisors arriving for a meeting with Senate Republicans, but expected to pay respects to Jimmy Carter, still lying in state in the U.S. Rotunda. We'll have special coverage tomorrow. Jimmy Carter's funeral at the National Cathedral here in Washington. Coming up on Balance of Power, President-elect Trump asking the Supreme Court now to intervene in his hush money case sentencing. We'll take a closer look ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Because I did nothing wrong. By the way, I did nothing, absolutely nothing wrong. If I did something wrong, I wouldn't be standing here right now because I've won all these cases. Nobody's ever won so many cases as I have against the Justice Department. I mean, Jack Smith had cases all over the place.
Donald Trump yesterday at Mar-a-Lago, his news conference, as the president-elect now asks the Supreme Court to halt his hush money case sentencing, which is currently set for Friday. This is new today. Joining us, Deanna Paul, associate at the law firm Walton, Mocht & Heron, former assistant district attorney for New York. Deanna, it's been a minute. Welcome back. We'll pick up where we left off here, I guess, in terms of Donald Trump's legal saga. But this is an important development today. What does it mean for the sentencing on Friday?
It means that we have to wait and see what the U.S. Supreme Court does with regard to the sentencing Friday. I think there's a reason that they say justice delayed is justice denied. Justice Merchan from Manhattan, he said in his ruling that, jury verdicts are really important, and jury verdicts are the first step in the appellate process. And so the conviction is really what is key here. And in order for that to become finalized, the sentencing needs to happen. Then the president-elect has 30 days to file an appeal. But without that, it's not final. And so this status as a felon can't really move forward and become a finalized status without the sentencing on Friday.
Which might be exactly what the president-elect is trying to avoid here, Deanna. And yet prosecutors had suggested it would be okay to put this off until Trump is out of office. And so I do wonder if this does happen now and this process plays out while he's still president, is it really going to go anywhere when he will literally be sitting in the White House for the next 4 years?
Nothing will happen while he's in the White House for the next 4 years. One of the arguments that his attorneys actually made both in their arguments to the New York court as well as to the U.S. Supreme Court is that presidential immunity should apply to him as the president-elect. It's a novel, it's a novel argument. It's never been raised before. We've never been in a situation like this before. But the notion that he shouldn't be taken away from transitioning into the presidency because he needs to prepare for this criminal sentencing is somewhat of a ridiculous idea. He was found guilty in May. So that's, 6-7 months ago. He's had more than ample time to prepare for his sentencing. And Judge Merchan has made it clear that he's sentencing him to an unconditional discharge. And what that means is that there's no strings attached. He's not going to prison. He's not going to have to pay a fine. There's no probation. He's literally a free man after sentencing on Friday. And so there's no time from the president-elect's schedule that will be taken up, but for this sentencing on Friday.
Well, so are we to believe then that 4 years from now, presuming he is only going to serve another term here, there'll be authorities waiting at the gates of the White House to extradite him to New York?
Not extradite him, but, administrations change, judges change, the priorities change. And in 4 years, it's hard to imagine that this case will just be kind of sitting around in 4 years waiting to sentence the then former president to an unconditional discharge.
Of course, this is not the only development or potential development we're watching when it comes to the legal issues of the former president. There's also been, in the last day, a lot of news surrounding whether or not the special counsel, Jack Smith, is going to be able to release a report on his findings of the federal investigations and ultimately indictments of Trump when it comes to both the classified documents case in Florida and the election subversion case here in Washington. Deanna, how exactly is this going to go from here? The DOJ has suggested it wants to release just the election subversion part after the judge in Florida blocked the release of the documents part. But is this ultimately up to an appeals court? Can the DOJ act unilaterally here? What's going to decide whether this comes out?
I think this is a question that a lot of people are asking. What it really comes down to, the president-elect he always has been very skilled at using the legal process to delay things. He did it brilliantly with the Manhattan case. He's, delayed the sentence up to the point where we're days away from his inauguration, and that might inevitably delay the sentencing forever. And the same thing with the Jack Smith case and his other litigations.
Well, what happens to a special counsel report that is complete but never sees the light of day? Is there some warehouse like in Raiders of the Lost Ark where this goes? Do they delete it? Or do we see this in some sort of book years from now?
Probably in some sort of book or in some sort of library. At some point it will be released at some point. We saw something similar with Matt Gaetz recently, but I don't have the answer for that. I don't think anyone really has the answer for that as we're sitting here today. But hopefully this does get resolved before Inauguration Day and Jack Smith is able to release the report, since that's what he thinks the just thing to do is in this matter.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we still have 12 days to go until Inauguration Day. But on Inauguration Day, the president-elect has promised pardons for those convicted of crimes related to the riot at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. This is something that House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries spoke about today on Capitol Hill. This is what he said, Deanna, and we'll have you respond.
Pardoning a violent mob that attacked the Capitol as part of a concerted effort to halt the peaceful transfer of power, seriously injured more than 140 heroic police officers, threatened to hang Mike Pence, assassinate the Speaker of the House, and hunt down members of Congress is the height of irresponsibility.
Deanna, you used to be an assistant district attorney in New York, and I wonder, as a prosecutor, your view on what mass pardons like this for people who in some cases were violent offenders, assaulting police officers, what that would potentially signal to people who would be thinking about that kind of behavior in the future as to whether or not it is appropriate and they would face repercussions for it.
I think that we're living in an unprecedented moment where hearing things like that and at the same time hearing the president-elect and other people talk about weaponizing the justice system are very much at odds and are not the things that we think of when we think, as certainly as a former prosecutor, that your job is to do justice. And the different ideas are very much at odds with each other.
I'm curious, Deanna, there's a question about whether Donald Trump goes with an across-the-board pardon on the J6 offenders or whether they go case by case. Do presidential pardons, if it's a case-by-case situation, person by person, do presidential pardons provide precedent potentially in court for the others?
As in for future presidents in office?
For the rest of the J6 rioters, if they're not all pardoned, could they not use the example of the other pardons to help their cases?
They can certainly point to it in court. I think a presidential pardon is something that the president does, but they can certainly go to court and argue that this happened for people in similarly situated positions. So yeah, I don't think it would be good precedent.
All right, Deanna Paul, associate at the law firm Walton Mackin Herron. Thank you so much. Of course, also former assistant district attorney in New York. We appreciate your time. Coming up, we'll have a preview of Donald Trump's meeting with Republican senators this evening. Our political panel will join us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power live from Washington, D.C. I'm Kaylee Limes alongside Joe Matthew. And we have our eyes on Capitol Hill this evening, where President-elect Donald Trump arrived just moments ago as he is expected to pay respects to former President Jimmy Carter, who's currently lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and then head into a meeting with Senate Republicans about the path forward for his legislative agenda. So joining us now for more on that note is this evening's political panel, Maura Gillespie, founder and principal at Blue Stack Strategies and Republican strategist, alongside Kevin Walling, vice president at HG Creative and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. It's great to see you here. Maura, if I could come to you first as the Republican on this panel. Republicans don't seem that they are entirely aligned on how they want to pursue immigration, energy, and tax reform. And it doesn't seem like Donald Trump is of a firm mind on this either. How quickly can he actually come to a decision? Do you think it could happen tonight?
I think that it's really important they have these conversations in private. I wish they had done this previous to making any announcements about a great one big bill or two bills. You know, that's a conversation that needs to be had internally. I think it adds to the confusion and then this idea that Republicans can't get it together and they are chaotic when they have these public disagreements. And so it's really important they're having in-house conversations right now about what the path forward looks like and how to get the votes they need in such slim majorities that they have here in Congress moving, looking ahead. They need to get a bill done. And I do believe that this first year for President Trump coming in is the most crucial. And so how can he get a win on the table, put a win on the board soon? It's this is where that really is the focus for both president and for Congress.
We spoke earlier today with Patrick McHenry, former Republican congressman, used to chair the House Financial Services Committee. He's seen this movie before. He says if Donald Trump wants one bill and tells them, they'll get it done. Have it in two bills, they'll get it done. But if he doesn't tell them anything, nothing will get done. They need direction is the idea here, Kevin. Will they get it tonight?
Well, potentially we'll see that play out tonight with the president right now with breaking news that he's on Capitol Hill. I think to Mara's point, you do have that divide. Obviously, Mike Johnson, Patrick McHenry's former colleague wants one bill, and the Senate is looking at more likely two bills to break out the border, energy, and taxes. But it is a question of what can pass. I think there's universal agreement from what I've seen on the Republican side that the House needs to move first, and the Senate will react to that through the reconciliation process. But to Mara's point, a lot of this has to happen behind closed doors. I think you see a more engaged, more serious Republican caucus. You saw it right after they were sworn in. They went to Fort McNair here in D.C. for that retreat to talk through this process because timing is of the essence, because then we're going into March with government funding deadlines, the debt ceiling deadlines. There really is a short time frame for them to move either this first bill or two bills.
Donald Trump is just speaking to reporters on Capitol Hill right now, saying we're looking at one bill versus two bills. Whatever we do, it's going to be great. we'll get it done. So I'm not sure we're provided any more clarity with those statements. We'll see if this changes throughout the course of the evening. My question is, Kevin, we've been framing this as basically something entirely for Republicans to figure out, and that only Republican votes will be advancing this legislative agenda. But we saw more Democrats yesterday voting for an immigration-related measure in the House, the Laken-Riley Act. There's tax reform measures and a SALT cap potentially being lifted. That could be good for blue states like New York and California. Should we entirely count Democrats out of this equation?
It's a really great question, and you saw those 9 Democrats sign on to the cloture vote. I think they're gonna bring that up for conversation. It was on Friday. Now it's moved to Thursday, and you saw Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the Democrats in the House, signaling in his introduction of Mike Johnson when he passed the gavel to him a willingness, as long as Democrats are at the table, to be involved in that process. You know, Mike Johnson's majority is about to get a lot smaller by 2 seats come January 20th, and this new administration taking over. So I think it's in their interest to bring Democrats to the table to get something done, similar to what we've seen with government funding fights in the past.
Just want to mention quickly what we're looking at here, a live view of the U.S. Rotunda in the U.S. Capitol, I should say. President-elect Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump have arrived at Jimmy Carter's casket in the middle of the reviewing here. This is a moment that we didn't necessarily know was going to happen in advance of his meeting with Senate Republicans. As we look at that live view, the catafalque, the platform that is holding the casket right now, the same one that was used for Abraham Lincoln, there is great history and tradition at play, which is something that we wanted to take a moment to bring you here on Bloomberg. As we spend time with our panel, Kevin and Maura Gillespie, he's going to go from here into this meeting. He already, by the way, spoke to the Speaker of the House. You worked for a former Speaker, John Boehner, and there is always a concern about being jammed by the Senate. Who goes first?
You know, it's going to be a matter of who has the plan, like you just talked about, who's got a path forward. Because I think when you're breaking it down by issues, yes, a lot of these members, there are ways to work together. Several of the members that you mentioned, the Democratic Party, their districts were won by President Trump. So they're going to look for ways to find common ground. They're going to want to support a package that helps their constituents as well. Because I think a lot of times we find ourselves, it's easy to silo, and a lot of the conversation has been all Republicans need to get on board with whatever plan it is. Yes, but there should also be an openness, as Kevin pointed out, to engage with members across the aisle and to find ways to bring them over. Because I think if you do end up doing one big bill, you may lose some of those Republicans. And so you're going to want to find things that can entice Democrats across the aisle to come on board and to vote for that package. So, you know, whichever side comes with the plan first, that's what you're going to see going forward.
Well, we also have questions about whether Democratic votes are going to be there for some of these nominees for the second Trump administration that are beginning their confirmation hearings next week. We've got Marco Rubio on the deck. Pete Hegseth is going to be getting his hearings on Tuesday. Maura, all of this just days ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration. Is this going to go smoothly, or is this going to be the first taste of potentially a nominee who can't actually make it through the U.S. Senate?
I think Marco Rubio's smooth sailing. You know, there are a couple that have not raised any flags, and you've heard Democratic senators who said, yep, they've got my support. You know, we'll still go through the process of the hearing, but I don't see any issues coming, you know, ahead of it. That's for, you know, a nice majority of them, but there are a handful that have not had successful meetings on the Hill. Their Senate meetings have not gone well. I'll say that a couple that I've heard of are Tulsi Gabbard. Kash Patel is a concern for many. And yes, Pete Hegseth and his stance on women in combat is a problem for not only Democratic senators, but Republican senators as well. So I think that it won't be a sure thing to get them all through, and even with the threats of primaries, some of these senators, they're not up for re-election until 28, which is the end of the Trump term. So it's going to be tough for a few of these nominees, but by and large, you'll see them get through.
Well, based on the 33-page letter issued by Senator Elizabeth Warren that included the 72 questions she would like to ask Pete Hegseth in the Armed Services Committee hearing next week, it's going to be a ripper. When you start looking down the line, though, John Thune needs your help, Kevin. He says, Democrats tell me the one or two I can confirm on day one. That seems to be the Secretary of State incoming here, Marco Rubio, and Elise Stefanik, Ambassador to the UN.
And likely John Ratcliffe, too.
Will they get that done?
I think so. I think they'll get those 3 by day one. Obviously, this was a priority of the Trump transition, right? He wanted a fairly full cabinet in place. And to Mara's point, you have a lot of Republican institutionalists, right? You have a lot of issues with paperwork not being turned in, for example, waiting for the FBI background checks. You had a meeting yesterday of the Republican Senate caucus where they talked about this very issue, whether we're going to proceed, especially those committee chairmen, with these hearings. And there was a lot of pushback in terms of wanting a full picture of these candidates with their FBI background checks. I think those three will likely sail through on day one. Saw Bill Cassidy raising concerns now as the incoming chair, as the chair of the Help Committee, with RFK Jr., for example. So I think you had all these ambitions with the Trump transition, naming all these folks very early on the process. We talked about this last year, late last year, with all the flurry of nominations.
Rapid fire.
And not many of those folks will actually be in place come January 20th.
Well, we'll have much more coming up with Maura Gillespie and Kevin Walling. Our panel stays with us as we move our conversation to President Biden's recent interview with USA Today. The exit interview, what he had to say about the election. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. We're spending time with our panel as President Biden sits for an interview with USA Today, the big exit interview, saying that he believed he could have won the presidential election in November based on polling that he saw. When asked directly, though, for more, if he had the vigor to serve another 4 years as president, he responded by saying in part, quote, "I don't know. Who the hell knows? So far, so good. But who knows what I'm going to be when I'm 86 years old," unquote. I guess that would go for all of us as we bring our panel back in, Maura Gillespie and Kevin Walling. That was the problem, though, Kevin, right? He couldn't promise the American people where he'd be at 86 years old.
Yeah, I mean, this was the interview with Susan Page was, obviously very candid, went on for an hour. That's a Joe Biden I actually like to see. You know, like, who the heck knows if I'm going to be around here? I think that was the Biden that won in 2020, kind of being frank.
But he thinks he could have won
candid.
again.
God love him, to quote the president, back to the president, if he thought that. I'm not familiar with any polling that showed, especially in the wake of that debate. And, I'm the biggest Biden guy out there.
Yes, right.
Who knows how that would have played out. But the polling was not there when the president decided to step back, and I don't think it would ever recover heading into November.
It was interesting as well when he was asked about what he regretted. He actually talked about things that he accomplished, but that no one was going to actually see the fruits of for some time. Things like infrastructure, for example, which was the conversation when he was still in the race we were having at beating a dead horse with, this notion that people were not yet feeling it. Will history reflect more kindly upon him, Maura, than the American electorate did over the last few years?
History tends to. I mean, we look fondly back on several of our world leaders and our American leaders more fondly after they've left office and realizing, how good it was before, and we didn't see it in the moment. So I'm sure there will be aspects of the Biden administration that we currently don't see as being fantastic for us that maybe will be, in years to come. I think that there is a issue, though, with how much time he'll have truly to see that kind of unfold. And we have presidents now that are, with Jimmy Carter's passing, and then you have Biden and then Trump, they're not going to have that much time in their post-presidency life to make a legacy for themselves. So really it does come down to what happened during their presidential years. And that's going to end up being their legacy because there won't be as much time, hypothetically, to really make a mark in their post-presidency years.
That's a great point. Kevin, he referred to the polling that he saw. Do we think he was shown the full picture when it comes to research and polling in this campaign when he was still in the race?
Yeah, I mean, it was widely reported at the time that he has an insular group of aides, and it's unclear, what was breaking through that core group of really loyal folks around the president that have been with him from the get-go. John Anzalone is a dear friend of mine, a political consultant and pollster who was on his first campaign, successful for 2020. He's been with him since the 80s in his first race for the presidency, and not necessarily involved in the reelect. It was a very top-level driven operation around the president for the reelection effort before he bowed out. And I think we'll get a clearer picture in the months as folks write their books and talk more on the record about their experiences at the end of the Biden administration.
All right, Kevin Walling and Maura Gillespie, thank you so much for being with us. Of course, tomorrow it won't be President Biden's legacy we're speaking as much about. Instead, it will be the legacy, as Maura mentioned, of former President Jimmy Carter, whose state funeral will be tomorrow, talk about a post-presidency. That is one of the things he will be remembered for, and we'll have special coverage of that state funeral beginning tomorrow at 9 a.m. New York time, and we'll have a special edition of Balance of Power beginning at 12 noon Eastern.
Special day tomorrow. Markets will be closed, but we will be here with important news and hope that you'll join us here on Balance of Power. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.